It's my enormous pleasure to welcome to this event our Professor of Rhetoric, with or without a K, Professor Melissa Lane, whose biography and bibliography takes a whole day to get through, I have to say. And she'll be talking about music in ancient Greece. So may I start with the first question? We tend to, like most of our culture, not consider the culture that we've inherited. So when it comes to music, most people don't sing together unless it's somebody's birthday, and then everyone picks their own key. And maybe at New Year's Eve. There are other cultures where people sing together more often. So we have variety around the planet. But ancient Greece is such a crucible of civilization. What do we know about the role of music in ancient Greece?
Great, thank you. So it's such a pleasure to be here, and I know that we'll do a proper thank you at the end, but since I have the floor, I just want to say how much this entire event owes to the incredible energy, vision, and really superhuman brilliance of our professor of music, Milton Mermikides.
Oh, that's good. Someone filming?
So we decided we would do this conversationally, as you can see. So we'll be engaging in a conversation throughout. So I like to start thinking about music in ancient Greece with the fact that the same word, nomos, nomoi in the plural, means both law and song. It's a type of melody in ancient Greece. And we see this in this text that's attributed to Aristotle, which I spoke about in my lecture on singing the laws here in September. And the question is, why are the nomoi, the laws that people sing, so called? It is because before they knew how to write, they sang their laws so as not to forget them. And so already today, we've really heard about the sense in which music, as Robin May said, is involves a responsiveness to social cues. He told us that the same part of the brain that picks up dissonance also is responsive to social cues. And you can see this relationship between law and song if you think that both are ways of regulating people's behavior, of getting people to attune themselves to one another, to know how to act, and to act collectively. And so they have this very deep relationship. And in ancient Greece, what that means is that what we translate, what gives us our word, music, which in Greek is mousikē, actually involves all of these three things. And in fact, in addition, we should also have dance on that slide, because as we heard also from Mort Kringelbach, and as was certainly true for the Greeks, as he said, one of his students has shown music and dance are one. And this was true for the Greeks. So if you think about a Greek tragedy, I was fortunate last weekend to be in Syracuse on Sicily, attending a performance of Sophocles in the ancient Greek theater there with students from Goodenough College here in London. And what we heard then was this all-encompassing art form. So a Greek drama was music, it was words, and it was dance, and it involved the community representing itself in the chorus, and also, especially in the earlier period of Greek drama, many of the members of the chorus and the actors were ordinary citizens. So there's that sort of incredible connection among people. And what that does is it really creates character and culture. And that's, I think, part of what we're next going to discuss. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you one more thought about the relationship of law and music and verse, because this is Solon, one of the great lawgivers of ancient Athens, who was himself a poet and actually put his laws, into the form of verse that could be chanted in order to ingrain them in people's memory and in their behavior. And we'll talk more about that, I think, in the course of the conversation. Here we have an image of the muses who preside over all of these forms of Greek music and poetry and drama. And that also reminds us that this art form of musicē, this combination of music, dance, poetry, verse, was also part of the relationship with the divine. These festivals where Athenian and other cities performed their dramas were actually festivals that were patronized by the gods. And so Apollo, for example, as the god who supposedly played a certain kind of Greek musical instrument, a kithara, versus Dionysus, who was associated with the pipes, sometimes called the flutes, the aulos. So the role of the gods was really crucial in this whole cultural complex of music.
So Plato and Aristotle wrote a lot about music not just being a skill in its own, these trees that Morton was talking about, but actually significant in education, not like as a well-rounded education, but something more core than that, and actually of being a good human, the soul.
Yeah.
What were they thinking?
Yeah, so this is great. So let me begin with, here's an image of a banquet scene. This is from a symposium. So I was just talking about public outdoor music, as it were, but the Greeks also had music. Elite people, men, would have symposia in private homes where also singing would be done both by performers who were more like professionals, but also the kind of happy birthday kind of singing or more elaborate singing of their own. So here you see some of those two instruments I was just talking about, the lyre and the one of the forms of the pipes. And so here we can come back again to the relationship of law and music. So one of the laws of a lawgiver from Catania in Sicily prescribed that the host of a banquet had to recite the preludes to the laws at each banquet. So this is like, if you have people over for dinner, you have to actually recite the preambles to the laws. And this is a way of, again, enculturating people and in training them politically as well as musically. So that's a kind of introduction to Plato, which was the question, because one of Plato's dialogues is called The Symposium, and it shows us Socrates at one of those banquets that we just saw pictured. I'll go back to the picture just for a moment. And Plato has some very technical ideas about music, which Milton is going to talk about a little bit later on, about what each musical mode signifies. You already mentioned that earlier today. But what I want to stress here is that Plato's ideas about music were philosophical and they were political. So actually in two of his dialogues, in the Republic and the Laws, Plato says that political revolutions begin in musical revolutions. It's when the form of music changes in a society that all the culture and therefore the laws and the political regime will change. And the reason is, again, that music shapes, as Robin May explained, music shapes people's emotional responses. It shapes their disposition. And if you think, what is character? What is our ethical character? It's a set of dispositions to respond to stimuli in a certain way. And so music is training us how to respond to that stimuli. And if we're all responding in a similar way as members of a community, then our laws and our society will be more stable. But if we start responding in every which way, then it'll be undermined. And so Plato actually attacks, I think one of the speakers earlier was talking about when does music go bad? And Plato, again, has a very specific idea of that in mind. He attacks what was known at the time as the new music. So you can think of this as the rock and roll or the Beatles of the 4th century BCE. And what that new music was doing was that it was mixing everything up from Plato's point of view. So instead of having very well-defined genres where one genre is a hymn or a paean to the gods, another genre is a lament, another genre is a dithyramb, instead of keeping those things separate, the new music was mixing them together, and it was using much more those pipes, which even mix in a way, slide from one pitch to the next. And also, the new music music was putting music above words. And so for Plato as a philosopher, the music should be supporting the words rather than kind of overwhelming and dominating. So I was actually trying to think of examples, and I thought about rap and hip hop, but of course those are cases where the words are actually really primary. So it's kind of the opposite in the case of Plato's new music. And so Plato is very concerned that the new music of his day is undermining Athenian, the stability of Athenian society.
It's not such a surprising thing to hear because every generation's parents, when you hit 35, suddenly the music is debaucherous. At one point, you couldn't put distortion on a guitar, then you couldn't drop the lower string. And we push these back. So that seems the same. And there are echoes also, I think, of flamenco, where we think of a whole culture and some political components as well. So this isn't without current practice. But the degree that music felt important is astonishing. You said that mousikē was not just the sound of music, but poetry. I didn't know about the law. That's fascinating. And that there's some theories, hypotheses that music came about to remember. So they become memorable. So, it's another thing that the Greeks gave to us. And also, sorry, there's an aside, the idea of acousmatic music, which us electronic musicians know a lot about, which is that you can think about sound as its own thing that divorced from its source. And this is ancient also. Yeah. So tell me more about that interweaving of music across the culture, please.
Yeah, great. So let's go past Karandis and to the connection between music and education and citizenship. So you just mentioned memory. And I think that, so Greek education really starts from this idea that humans are mimetic creatures. We're creatures who imitate and respond, and we're embodied creatures, and we're social creatures. And so Greek education was rooted in the idea that we need to educate the youth to orient their actions to the good of the whole community. And the way that you do that, again, is by that sort of both subliminal, initially a kind of subliminal training through the way that music affects our characters and kind of...
There was a purity to the music.
Exactly.
That would, without it, would basically poison the generation.
Exactly. And so Aristotle actually devotes almost a whole book of his Politics to Book 8, the final book. Almost all of it is a discussion of music. What purpose should music serve in children's education? And we heard earlier about the importance of pleasure as part of Aristotle's theory of eudaimonia, of well-being or flourishing. But it's really important that Aristotle thought that the key to education was that you're trying to align pleasure, honor, and virtue, so that people should take pleasure in acting in the virtuous ways that the survival and flourishing of the political community requires. And again, being part of music collectively, learning how to judge music, learning how to perform it, learning how to participate, learning how to be a good spectator at those dramatic festivals is really one of the best things. And because you mentioned flamenco, I was just going to mention actually an amazing production that I once saw of Antigone was done by a flamenco troupe. Yep. And it worked really well because the chorus, one character would come out and be the sort of protagonist, and then the chorus would sort of gather around them and sort of be cheering them on. And I think that sort of interplay between the community and the individual really captured the spirit of Greek music.
So we hear echoes and see echoes of ancient Greek culture, but what do you think is the sort of lasting legacy of it? Is there a particular music culture which is bound to the idea of virtue? I mean, I can think of some, but I'm very interested in what you think, because the more I think about it, that's how we make groups, what we listen to when we're younger. But this seems so organized and so high level and didactic, actually, which is what is unusual. Although the universities decide what is good to learn, so that still lasts, I suppose, that authority figure.
Yeah, so I was trying to think about, so here's another example. I just love this stuff about Charondas. So here's another thing that his laws, remember we saw in the previous slide that he prescribed that his laws should be sung at the banquets in Catania, his actual city. But what's interesting about this is Charondas' laws, so the laws for this other city, were being sung in Athens. So they had become part of this kind of broader Greek cultural network where the way that you thought about, what is a good political life was to kind of think about, well, who has good laws and, how can we sort of internalize and engage with them? And so I was thinking about, what are ways where music does resonate in those ways for us today politically? And so we might think of the Marseillaise and the role that that plays, Jerusalem here in the United Kingdom. And I promised I would do a teeny bit of singing because here's a good example of how music can enculturate someone. When I was growing up in the United States, there were sort of public service things on the radio and public television for children that set the preamble of the United States Constitution to music. And to this day, some 40 plus many years later, I can sing the beginning lines of the preamble. So here we go. So it was, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility," right? And then it went on from there. Okay, so that's just a good example. But, I literally have not thought about...
Another verse and I would have been American.
I literally have not thought about that for 40 years, and I still remember it. So I think that's the sort of example of why singing the laws could be so powerful and why music could have such a tremendous, deep force in political community.
So the idea of memory and music, I know that there is one evolutionary potential of music in that if you intone sermons on pictures, you have more stamina and you can mark out sections.
Yeah.
But the idea of making it more memorable is really interesting because if we don't have music notation or recording devices, which are not till 19th century, then music is only carried in the cradle of the air and our memories down generations. So what we get is what is the most memorable. Otherwise, it wouldn't come down to us. So it's fascinating that they used that for the laws. They had some awareness that would work.
Yeah. Well, of course, archaic and classical Greece are just at that cusp of transitioning from being largely oral societies to being societies that use writing. And I talked about that a lot this year in my Gresham lectures on the role of writing law and the role of sort of unwritten laws. And I think the important point is that actually in that time, but also in our own time, writing and memory and orality actually kind of coexist. It's not that one just 100% supersedes the other. But having said that, the Greeks, because it was a more oral culture and writing was still a relative novelty, and the Athenians were largely literate, but Athenian citizens, but still they didn't use writing for all the ways that we do. And so, we can imagine these rhapsodes who recited all of Homer from memory. So, Homer is, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and that was what it was to be a rhapsode, was that you would go around to these festivals around ancient Greece, to Delphi and Olympia and other places, and you would recite Homer. So, they did place more emphasis on memory, but I think that still we should be aware that there's a dialectic between writing and memory and orality, probably in all cultures.
You've articulated beautifully what ancient Greek music was. Do you think we could learn anything from that approach? Is it too didactic, or is the idea of music for all something that we should pursue?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. I've been thinking about it a lot. I mean, of course, in one way, we live in a much more liberal society. We are open to many different kinds of music. We don't want the state to prescribe one single set of kinds of musical genres. On the other hand, there's a book that I once read which had the title Keeping Together in Time. And the idea was that that's really fundamental to music, actually to military life, and so to kind of political organization. And I think that perhaps the idea that we might take the most would be this idea from Aristotle of the role of music in education, that educating children in, let's say, all the varieties of music actually enables them to participate more intelligently in the life of the community. And it's not an accident that in political philosophy, people are constantly using the metaphor of the musical conductor or the string quartet playing together, right? We think of that kind of attuned interaction between people as a kind of paradigm for politics. And so through participating in music, children can be acculturated to what it is to be a citizen. And I think that's true even if we kind of broaden and liberalize our conception of the modes of music that will nurture citizenship. And perhaps that's a good moment for me to invite you to say something more about the modes of Greek music.
So what's interesting about ancient Greek music is that, firstly, there's an enduring influence of very basic things that we just take for granted to this day. And they sort of intuited something that turned out to be very true. More complicated as ever, but very true. So let's try something, because why not? What I'd like you to do is I'm going to play a low note, and I'm going to play another note. When I play the other note, I'd just like you to raise a hand or a pamphlet for how dissonant it feels, how spiky, how angular. Okay? So here's one note, here's another one. So I do it loud. No movement whatsoever. How about this? Oh, you're hard to move. How about this? God. You're too good, you guys. How about this? All right. Why do we know that? We didn't rehearse that. You don't know what the note... Some of you know what the notes are, I know, but others don't. I'm going to pick a different key so we can... We'll start here. Ready? So we've got a mixedy sort of thing. How about this? Right, so you're doing something that is absolutely perfect for this demonstration, which is you are intuiting a relationship between those notes. Every time we hear a note, it's essentially a frequency. It's oscillating at a certain speed. You can think of it as Pythagoras did on a monochord. That's a monochord on the bottom left here. That looks like a fun day out, doesn't it? And you can see that on each of these instruments, there's some numbers here, and some of them are low binary numbers, 2, 4, 8, and there's some prime numbers there. And it's this idea that a simplicity of maths was a sort of purity of music that you seem to align to. No one moved when I played octaves. And that the universe itself, which we'll dig into more later, obeyed such laws. Again, it's more complicated and interesting than that. So the ancient Greeks came up with the idea that simple ratios, you can think of that as half the monochord or 2/3 of the monochord. Usually it's turned upside down, the frequency. If you double the frequency, you have an octave. No one moved for the octave. When I doubled it again, no one moved. So it seems when we double octaves, we feel like it's almost like the same note. And there's physical reasons why that is the case. Some things are uncultured, but there are others that are physical. But you'll notice that they built scales by using low numbers. The lower the number, the purer, the more settled these were. So they had the idea that a unit of musical material came within an octave, which is an elegant idea. And in fact, they divided the octave into 4 strings of 2 harps. I usually call this section liar, liar, but no one laughs, so I cut that out. And so basically, you could have a way of dividing the 4th on one harp, a way on the other, and then you construct scales so that they would close and be pure. There are various ways to do it based on numbers, but I'll just show you the basic premise. This might need to be boosted a little bit. Beautiful, that's a diatonic genus, the chromatic genus, and the enharmonic one. I like it. And then you can construct scales. Lovely. And you can construct many scales using this way. Pythagoras, what do you know Pythagoras for?
theorem.
Triangles, right? So he liked threes. And his idea was that how do we construct the vocabulary of music? Because if we just double and get octaves, we get nothing. We don't want to pick arbitrarily because character and virtue. But what we could do is basically multiply by 3. If it goes too high, we just bring it down an octave and keep going up. So Pythagorean tuning, you will only see numbers divisible by 3 and 2 on these ratios. So that's 3 over 2, 9 over 8. You can see the red is the 3 number. And you can go ridiculous, but then you're not so pure the higher you go. But there are notes available by going below the octave, down an octave, dividing by 3. And so you get these. So what you have is like a sun with orbiting planets at more and more complex, but related and harmonically pure intervals. And there is this sense that as pervaded, and if you've been to my lectures, you'll see that in many music forms, going up the fifths gives a sense of major brightness. You can see it's got major thirds and augmented notes, and going down is dark. So let's play with a few of these. And down. And then we can make music with this. Nice. Maths and music is cool. In the Victorian era, there was you may know more about this than me, but there was this devouring of ancient Greek literature, particularly in music theory. Do you know Kathleen Schlesinger's The Greek Owlus? No. So she studied all the primary sources she could, and then she started, when that wasn't enough, she started looking at images of flutes and trying to calculate these. Some suggest that she went a little bit too far of what they couldn't construct, but her approach has this ancient quality and probably for a lot of us angular. I happen to find it beautiful, but you'll see that it goes far away from our solar center. It's an acquired taste like coffee. This is called the Saturn scale, appropriately. I happen to love it, but yes, it takes time to acclimatize. Because what we have done now is destroyed that purity. Other than octaves, we have stretched these notes on the keyboard so that they don't obey that. It's a long, long story. Art of the tuning, the first year, we'll give you an hour of that sort of material. But it's amazing what came from this culture. Another thing was the idea of Plato thought that the modes had moral implications. Now, it's a bit complicated because we use the same name for the modes now, but the different modes, so I'll try and talk you through it. But he had a description to ones which were permissible and ones which were forbidden, which I'd be in big trouble at that time. So this apparently is spirited and courageous, and I'll use a modern example for you to hear it, approved by Plato. He would call it Phrygian, but it's really Dorian in our modern language.
Are you going to Scarborough Fair?
It's that green note that comes.
Parsley, sage,
Rosemary.
rosemary,
That's the one. That moment. He approved of that. Courageous and spirited. I feel it as pastoral, hopeful, but slightly sad. A natural minor wouldn't have that hope in there. It would have this slightly sadder, but it gives you a moment of hope in that darkness. So Plato liked that one. He also liked Dorian, which we confusingly call Phrygian. And called so you got no chance of getting it right. Approved by Plato, steady, rational, and disciplined. This is associated with darkness these days. But I suppose it is disciplined in a military way, I imagine. Now for the modes that Plato hated. Mixolydian, that we call Lydian, mournful and decadent, which is now associated with hope, dreaminess, and film music. So it shows that there are cultural changes. It doesn't make any sense, his thing to me. So I'm wondering how arbitrary or just just an opinion, basically, to put forward, just to have some level of control. And the strangest one, Ionian, which we call Ionian, is the major scale, which is soft, indulgent drinking music. I like most of those words. There you go. It has a bit of bite, but I don't think we can say. We can't say that this is indulgent. Maybe it is, but I do feel like drinking, so maybe he had a point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Shall we get some questions in?
I was just looking at the Ionian mode, the major scale. Was there an F sharp in it?
On the one you heard just then.
Well, notated. It wasn't.
It might be just. Don't ignore that. That's sloppiness.
Okay,
but it's very good to bring that sloppiness to the attention of the whole world. No. I'm 99.7% correct, but I don't let perfection be the thief of joy.
I've done lots of associated board theory to it.
Yeah, so that would be the mournful Lydian, which makes us want to reconsider our lives.
I mean, we can say that, why did Plato make those sort of what seem to us maybe strange and arbitrary associations? I mean, I think we do have to say they are partly ideological for him. So he has a gendered sense here. So, for example, the mournful music was associated with what could become excessive in his eyes, excessive sort of lamenting by women. Exactly. And also, there's also a kind of ethnicizing, othering going on. So the Lydians...
Were they associated with actual regions?
Yeah, so they're associated with regions that are kind of quite more questionably semi-Greek or less Greek or something like that. So there's a lot of, unsavory associations, I think, that are part of his classifications there. I think we had a question here. The microphone is just coming.
Sort of a dumb question, I'm afraid. In Greek plays, let's say Aristophanes or Euripides, are all the parts sung or just the chorus? Or is the chorus sung?
Yeah, so the chorus would have been typically sung. Most of the time, the spoken sort of words by the characters aren't sung. So they're spoken. There are moments where you get solo characters who do have a kind of, a lament or something like that. But there's a lot of in Greek drama, there's a lot of sort of back and forth, stichomathia, it's called in Greek, stichomythia, so that, like I say something and then you say something and then I say something, it's a sort of back and forth, and that's not sung. So it's not that the whole thing is sung, but the chorus would have been sung. But of course, we don't know exactly how the chorus music actually sounded, so a lot of different attempts have been made to sort of explore that or reproduce it. But the rhythms of the Greek language are very important because it's an accented language, so it has even the people who aren't singing are, in our mind, almost chanting because it's rhythmic.
Thank you. Just listening to that, how difficult is it to recreate these sounds? Because the musical instruments would have been made with particular types of wood and glues or what have you. So how confident are you that you can accurately
I'm
recreate
sure we
music?
could make everything they had. What we don't know is exactly what they had because most of the instruments are long destroyed. So as we saw, the longest remaining unambiguous instruments are flutes because they tend to be out of bone with holes in it, but strings aren't going to last long on any on any instrument. We have some writings about it where we can have that. I don't think it's very hard, and actually what's astonishing is that it's a question of how we tune notes. See, most people go to the piano and just don't question. I've taught at primary school, I've taught at PhD level. Very rarely does someone ask why are there 12 notes and why are there these 12, because we, like goldfish, swim in our culture. But there are points in history where people wanted to re-question that, so that Schlesinger brought that back. Early electronic music, Delia Derbyshire of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, didn't have a keyboard connected to her since, and she had log tables actually manually worked out before she started. She had to decide, am I going to use a Pythagorean third or a just major third? Yeah. So we can recreate and we can analyze at a very high degree of precision now, but to know exactly what the music was at the time is sadly lost forever.
Because we don't know exactly, for example, how the strings were tuned, for the stringed instruments, so that makes a huge difference. I mean, they were beginning to evolve notation, but it didn't give all the information that modern notation gives.
It was almost like a mnemonic sort of memory, okay. Yeah. Because if you're chiseling, you don't want to write, mezzo forte. Right. Who has time for that?
My question was thinking about the modes, and especially the characteristics that maybe Plato associated with them. I was thinking about chords versus melodies. And do you think that in some cases chords are designed to create the atmosphere against which a melody?
It seems that it was
plays?
largely monophonic or homophonic, which is notes either moving the same or in parallel motion. Harmony is a later construct as far as we know. I think that's as much as I know. Yeah.
A slightly different question, I think. I'm fascinated to know that they had new music in Greece and they were worried about it. How much do you think that music causes cultural change, or cultural change causes the change in music? Are they just impossible to disentangle?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think probably impossible to disentangle is the right way to think about it. But I mean, there are moments of musical innovation that people remember as really Monteverdi, Elvis Presley. There are these sort of moments where people think something really fundamental changed, and it did have kind of knock-on effects in the way that the culture was organized. So I think there's certainly a role for individual innovation, within music, but how much is that itself fed by features of the culture? It's the kind of old structure and agency debate that we always have about, explaining history kind of more generally. But as I said, Plato twice in his works says changes in politics start with changes in music. So he thinks there is a very clear directional path that might be followed, and he coins the word theatrocracy. So, like, we have democracy, and he comes up with the idea of like a culture that's ruled by the theater, where instead of
fabulous.
He was against it. So the idea is that instead of the state sort of making sound judgments rationally about what was good, now the composers and the performers and the people who were just taking pleasure in music but unmoored from the virtues would start to kind of just run wild. And it's really about, I mean, in a way, it's an interesting problem because it's sort of about the lack of deference to expertise is one way of thinking about that. So he was concerned that everybody thought they could judge music instead of the people who sort of really understood how music was needed to kind of serve the community.
And that position remains in some institutions.
Yeah. I think there was one more question here, wasn't there?
I'll just say one thing quickly, is that there's a powerful force of composers and musicians wanting to be to revolt against the music that they've inherited, or to at least be individualistic. So, I mean, what were counted as a distorted guitar in 1950 is laughable now. And it's so distorted now that the kids have no way to go. So there's this new culture of unplugged electric guitar. That's the way they're saying that. There's this approach called Black MIDI, where you just use your computer and just paint pictures with the thing. everyone hates it apart from the people who like it. And I think that group finding, or conversely, composers who want to make their mark, that will always happen. And I don't think there's no authority big enough to keep that in check.
So there was one more question there.
Yes, just a quick question. It may not be relevant here, but I'm just wondering where the tempered scale fits into this, as we're talking quite a lot about harmony.
Yeah, so as I said, the equal tempered system has taken over much of Western music thinking and education. It's a Victorian thing. It wasn't again, I'll refer you to my lecture, but Mozart had different types of thirds. And so this is just something that we've lost partly because of the democratizing of music, and the teaching of it and notation is far easier, and building a piano they used to have split keys, so you had different types, G sharp and A flat were separate. It's just, there's so many reasons. And one of the main reasons is polyphony, chords. Using the just intonation, these true things, is very, very complicated, and you end up like Harry Partch with 47 divisions. But I was talking to someone today, Indian classical music has a drone, and they frequently use glissandi and in some cultures 22, the 22 shruti, and they're completely bound to this. Whether there was a through route or whether it was convergent evolution of idea is not clear, but there is a huge culture of people writing microtonal or pure music, they would say. Now, it's this wonderful time to be alive because you can do all of these things and find out about it. I think that's a good way to end. One more round of applause for the wonderful Professor Lane. Beautiful.